Socialism. It's a buzzword used both by its supporters and its detractors, but many on both sides don't really know what it means. What exactly is socialism? What is its history? And how does it relate to communism? Let's break it down. The philosophical roots of socialism began early, at least as far back as the ancient Greeks. Simply the idea that people can rule themselves and meet each other's needs outside of a marketplace. This kernel began to pop as we approached the 1800s, developing through the French Revolution and the European revolutions of 1848. The term socialism is believed to have first been coined by the Frenchman Pierre Leroux in 1832. He was dubbed by his critics as the utopian socialist. Leroux, like many of his contemporaries, held an optimistic view that society could sustain itself through mutual aid and goodwill. It was a happy vision, but for the socialists to come, there was no room for happy idealism, only anger. The 1840s brought to prominence the most significant contributor to socialist thought, the German philosopher Karl Marx. To him, socialism wasn't some land of bliss where everyone can live in carefree harmony. It was a tool for the oppressed working class to remove their rulers and eliminate the class structure of society. The concept of socialism calls for the means of production, factories, farms, banks, and the like, to be owned not by private individuals, but collectively by the citizens as a whole. Central planning, rather than a free market, drives the economy. But Marx recognized that socialism was simply the path towards the political system he prescribed, communism. In 1848, Karl Marx and his pal, Friedrich Engels, wrote the Communist Manifesto. Between this and Marx's other writings, he laid out his vision for a society run by the working class. While drawing from many who came before him, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Darwin, Marx's ideas proved to be especially radical. In his manifesto, he wrote that, in its simplest form, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. Individuals own nothing. Society, as a collective whole, owns everything.
The oppressors of generations who have kept you down with myths of opportunity, we give it back to you, the people.
While Marx believed the progression of society inevitably leads to communism, he also believed that getting there requires revolution to cast down and eliminate opposition.
Karl, that kills people!
Marx knew this, but he was okay with it. Under his framework, individual human lives were less important than the collective system. He wrote that, quote, "Communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience." Yikes. Without private property, communism simply calls on people to produce what society needs them to produce, and society in return gives back everything they need. As Marx put it, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Everything is covered. So we have the theory, but how did this all work in practice? Well, Marx never actually got to see communism implemented anywhere, due to a particularly debilitating case of death in 1883. But this was destined to change. The lack of communism, not the death part. Fast forward to the Russia of 1917. In the midst of World War I, dissatisfaction with the monarchy hit a breaking point. Revolution flared, the Tsar was killed, and when the smoke cleared, all of a sudden, Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks were in charge. Turns out, Lenin and his party were big fans of Karl Marx, and, consistent with Marx's model, they wanted to follow up this revolution with communism. A few years in, and communist Russia was at the head of a new powerhouse communist state, the Soviet Union. Funny thing though, turns out a communist government owning everything didn't translate to the people owning everything. It just meant that the political leaders managing the government held all the power.
I thought we were an autonomous collective.
You're fooling yourself. We're living in a dictatorship.
Promised freedom and empowerment by Marx's ideology. Instead, the people of the Soviet Union found themselves with a stagnating economy that lacked any innovation, no economic mobility, widespread famine, and effectively no civil rights. If you stood in the way of the government, or simply believed differently, you got squashed.
Come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
Lower estimates show that over 20 million Soviet citizens were killed by their government under the reign of Joseph Stalin alone. But this was only the beginning. Throughout the 20th century, communism spread like wildfire. North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, parts of Africa, and of course, the People's Republic of China, where Mao Zedong killed at least 50 million of his own people. Thankfully, after taking a heavy toll on the 20th century, communism proved unsustainable across much of the globe. Now, as of 2022, the communist map looks like this. While the deaths are staggering, we also mustn't forget the numbers forced to live under absolute oppression, even today. It seems objectively clear that Marx's communism had a shockingly negative impact on the people forced to live under it, though his defenders would argue that true communism has never really been tried, seeing as Marx's vision did not include as powerful a government as the regimes that rose up. And yet, the history of these regimes seems to prove that communism truly can't exist in the theoretical way Marx believed, because its tenets contradict human nature. Communism can only exist at the point of a gun, as executed by Lenin and Mao. Despite the utter economic and human rights catastrophe communism has brought upon the world, many in the US now openly advocate for socialism here.
Let's talk about democratic socialism, not communism, Mr. Bloomberg. That's a cheap shot.
It's really not, though. Socialism is the engine of Marx's communism. It's socialism taken to its logical conclusion. All of it comes from Marx, and as Lenin himself explained, the goal of socialism is communism. Socialism and freedom cannot, by their very nature, coexist, and with the growing popularity of socialism today, we find ourselves at a crossroads.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
This is the time to stand. America's future depends on us winning this fight.